Hello and welcome to this introduction to my new book called The Frontier Sea, which covers the Napoleonic Wars in the Adriatic. This is going to be a relatively brief introduction, talking about some of the key elements into it that went into the writing of the book, and picking out one or two things which I think people might find interesting. We should probably start by talking about the scene of the events, the Adriatic Sea, probably very familiar to many Western tourists who flock there each year in their many thousands. It's about 460 miles long. Width varies, but 100 miles is fairly typical. Venice is, of course, the best known city right at the top of the Adriatic. And then going down the eastern side, we have Istria in modern Croatia, down the Dalmatian coast through Montenegro, Albania, and finally to Greece. The eastern coast, generally known as the Dalmatian coast, is actually a narrow coastal strip of land dominated by mountains above it. It has some cities or large towns. Trieste in the north, through to Split, Ragusa, which today is known as Dubrovnik, and Katara, which again today is known as Kotor in Montenegro. There are a large number of islands, some quite large, some very small, some totally unoccupied, which made navigation quite challenging for the ships of the period. This was added to by some very poor maps, and also had a famous wind called the Bora, which could blow as hard as 220 kilometers per hour. A Russian naval officer, Brunevsky, described his first contact as the wind with an apparent aspiration and an extraordinary strength burst from behind the mountains, raising clouds of dust, tearing out trees and peeling the roofs of houses. This added to the challenges facing naval forces in what, of course, was an age of sail. The key players at the start of our story are Venice, which still controlled quite a lot of the Dalmatian coast at the outset until the French arrived, Austria, which dominated the north, and the Ottoman Empire, which dominated currently Bosnia and Serbia, down through Albania and Greece. It had a nominal controls. I'll talk in a minute of Montenegro, but that was effectively independent. And then our story covers many of the incomers to the period. France arrived through its Italian campaigns. Britain arrived largely from its bases in Sicily and Malta and Egypt later, arrived with the Royal Navy. And probably the less well-known intervention was by the Russians, which again I'll talk about at the moment. One theme in the book, which I do want to emphasize, is that this was a theatre of war where communications back to the governments and military leadership was very lengthy indeed for most of the key players. This meant that officers, often very junior officers, had to make decisions on their own initiative. And these were not just military decisions, they were often taking diplomatic decisions as well. So all about the contents of the book. I'm not going to go through all the chapters in it, but this is just give you a flavour of what's in the book. In the first chapter, I talk about the Adriatic before 1797, setting the scene, talking about the major countries and explaining the challenges of naval warfare, which is obviously a key part of the story. In chapter 2, I talk about how war came to the area and the revolutionary. I think the gap, the definition between revolution and Napoleonic Wars is one that isn't really worth pursuing. But essentially, the war came as a result of the Revolutionary Wars, in particular, changing ownership of the Ionian Isles. Most people will be familiar with Corfu, but there are also other islands in that grouping. The Russians made their first appearance in the Mediterranean during this period, and the French and Ali Pasha, which I'll return to, one of the Ottoman governors, also had a conflict. And this was around the period of the War of the Second Coalition, 1799 to 1801, which resulted in various changes of ownership, in particular gave the French a foothold in the region. In chapter 3, I sort of move away a bit from the general narrative, which is largely chronological, to talk about what I call small wars in the Balkans. This was the Balkans did have some very large-scale wars, particularly the Russia-Turkish wars, but most of the conflicts were small wars, and particularly this was around the military border, which was the Austrian defences in what is modern day Croatia, very largely. This was where the famous Grens lived. They essentially were given land in return for military service. And on the other side of the border in modern day Bosnia and Serbia were the Ottomans, who raided backwards and forwards with the Grenzer in the small war, which continued even when the major conflicts ended. So I talk about those conflicts in this chapter, and they went all between the Austrians and the Ottomans. There were plenty of conflicts within the Ottoman Empire. This was a period where the empire was not quite disintegrating, but there were very powerful warlords who controlled and operated semi-autonomously in the region. And the most famous of those is Ali Pasha, which I describe in the book in some detail. In chapter 4, we move on to the French expansion in the period. This is between 1802 and 1809. This came as a result of campaigns in Italy, down through the Dalmatian campaign of 1806, where the Russians intervened. There was I talk about some of the other campaigns in the Balkans because they do very much impact, of course, the Dalmatian coast is part of the Balkans, and these other campaigns did have an impact, particularly issues like a little-known naval attack by the Royal Navy on Istanbul, led by Admiral Duckworth, which had shades of the later, more famous Gallipoli-Dardanelles campaign of the First World War. We had the first of the major Russo-Turkish wars of this period. Of course, there have been plenty more before. And the First Serbian Revolt. And the Russo-Turkish wars are important because the Russians could only get into the Adriatic when they weren't at war with the Ottomans, which wasn't very often. And so there were sort of windows of opportunity. But when those windows closed as a result of the broader wars, the Russian fleets were left somewhat isolated in the Adriatic and had to sail the long way home to get to their bases in the Baltic. In chapter 5, I talk about France going on the defensive. War broke out again between the Russians and the Ottomans. We had a British Adriatic offensive, which I'll talk about some of the characters in that, where the Royal Navy played a very important role. The Kingdom of Naples was essentially the western side of the Adriatic in this period, so its conflicts were important. And then the Serbian revolt, second revolt, kicked off again, which rather finished off the period. And in the final substantive chapter, I go into some detail about the armed forces of the period. And in an annex, I also cover some of the wargaming issues and how you can cover some of these campaigns for those of you who have got an interest in wargaming. But this chapter will give you details of the various regiments and units that fought in the area, which themselves are very interesting. They weren't just the traditional line regiments, although those did fight, but all the combatants recruited locally and brought in foreign regiments to fight in actions during the war. I thought what I'd do, rather than just playing through all the chapters, just pick out some of the more interesting characters in the campaign. So the first one in the top left-hand corner, we have Ali Pasha of Ioannina. He was an Ottoman governor, but in practice was a semi-autonomous warlord. There's been several very good biographies, so I'm only sort of picking out some key points in the book and here. He was supplied by the French and the British. The British famously supplied him with 600 Congreve rockets, which sadly he didn't use to fight the French as the British hoped, but used it to attack one of his internal enemies. He was, to put it mildly, a fairly bloodthirsty character. Richard Davenport, a British author, wrote a biography of him. He put it bluntly: "I have never followed any road previously travelled by Ali Pasha without seeing some newly filled up grave or some wretches hanging on trees. His footsteps are tainted with blood." Well, that's probably a tad harsh, but not inaccurate by any means when the story. So I tell some of the examples and the stories around that. The next character in the right-hand top corner is King Petar of Montenegro. Montenegro was semi-independent, as I said earlier, and they were certainly Russian allies, given their similar religious links. The French did their best, but the Montenegrins were pretty pro-Russian. Russian officers described Montenegrin boys firing off their pistols, shouting, "Long live our Tsar Alexander, may the infidel perish." Others were full of praise for hospitality they received, although they were a bit disconcerted by the Montenegrin habit of firing gunshots very close to them, not least also the practice of chopping the heads off their enemies, and not always their enemies. The next character is one of three on the bottom of this slide, which are representative of the characters who arrived in the Adriatic. They're not locals. And the first one of this is on the left is Vice Admiral Senyavin, who was a Russian admiral. The Russians had the largest fleets in the Adriatic during the Napoleonic Wars. At its height, Senyavin commanded 15 ships of the line and smaller ships as well, and had a significant infantry forces to support those. I think he's a very good example of how they use their own initiative. Although he's quite a senior and experienced Russian naval commander, he was, no way could he get instructions from Moscow. So essentially, he used a decision. One example of that is that he decided to occupy the forts of the Bay of Cattaro ahead of the French arriving there, encouraged to do so, in fact, by King Peter of Montenegro. So that's Senyavin. The next rather superb painting, which I like, is of Marshal Marmont. He was the French commander who was appointed. He brought his units into Dalmatia and was appointed by Napoleon eventually as Duke of Ragusa and the governor of what became known as the Illyrian provinces. Pretty challenging administrative job. There were 7 different languages, for example, in the region, and he had, again, diplomatic and military challenges facing him all the way through that period. Marmont is probably better known for his failures in the Peninsular War, particularly the Battle of Salamanca. But I think his overall military record is not as bad as has been portrayed. And particularly in the Dalmatian campaign, the historian John Elting called it a remarkable 300-mile march through frequently roadless country, scattering to Austrian forces. And the final character I draw attention to is Captain William Hoste, who was a Royal Navy commander, a classic frigate commander in the Nelson mode. In fact, he was a Nelson protege. He arrived in the Adriatic on board the frigate Amphion, 32-gun frigate, which was not large by the standards of the later Napoleonic Wars, at least. That was February 1808. And in classic Royal Navy standards of the sort you can read in many fiction books of the period, they captured enemy ships and trading vessels. Hoste alone took 38 merchant ships in the first quarter of 1808 alone, burnt another 6. However, he was disappointed by the small amount, as he saw it, of prize money. This is something that naval commanders and their crews gained from when they captured enemy shipping. He got £6,000 for those 38 merchant ships, which today is worth about £500,000. You think he'd be pleased, but he actually had a rather spendthrift father who wasted much of the resources he sent home. But it wasn't just fighting ships on sea the Royal Navy did. Host and his men would often launch boats and cut out enemy ships in harbour. They would sometimes, at least temporarily, capture harbours, and they would certainly cut off roads and intercept French supply lines, forcing them to go further inland. He's probably most famous for the Battle of Lissa in 1811. Lissa is the modern Croatian island of Vis. His 4 frigates faced 6 French frigates, a couple larger than his, plus supporting vessels, and defeated them. He also returned later back to the Adriatic, albeit as a subordinate commander, but again played a key role in some of the later events in our story. So those, I thought, would be just some of the more interesting characters. There are many more of them, which I cover in the book. So this isn't just a narrative history. This is one where there are personalities. So essentially, my conclusion really in the book is that most of the great powers contested the lands in the Adriatic Sea during the Napoleonic Wars. It wasn't a major theatre of operations, but it was part of the overall strategy of most of the combatants. It played an essential role in influencing alliances and diverting troops and ships, which all helped to defeat Napoleon. It was also a period of significant change, both militarily but also socially in the region. And although whilst there was a short return to the status quo, certainly the intervention of the French and others resulted in significant political change, which showed itself later in the 19th century. Essentially, this is a story of strategy and small wars, with many colourful personalities playing their part in a fascinating, if violent, tale across what I call the frontier sea. So my last slide, as you can see, is my sales pitch. You can read much more. There's a dedicated page on the Balkan history, military history website, where there are some extracts from the book, and some other clips and material, and some more material for war gamers and modelers who might also, I hope, be attracted to this part of the Napoleonic Wars rather than the more mainstream ones that tend to get all the coverage. If you want to buy a copy of the book, you can get it at your local bookshop, which I hope you will support. They probably won't stock it immediately, but you can certainly order it through them. You can get it on Amazon, both in the paperback and the Kindle version, or in the UK. I'm sorry, can't do overseas posting, but you can in the UK you can order it directly from the website address above. Hope that was helpful, an interesting introduction to what I think is a fascinating story and a little told part of the Napoleonic Wars. Hope you found that useful, and thank you for listening. Good night.